Hello, my name is Kenneth Kemp. I'm Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And today I'll be talking about evolution. My article on that topic is at ect.org. The first thing we need to do is to be as clear as possible about the meaning of the word evolution. Some people use the word to refer to some imagined or hypothesized universal process effective from the earliest traceable cosmical changes down to the latest results of civilization. This idea has found both materialist and spiritualist proponents. In science, however, the word is generally put to a more modest use. In science, evolution can be used to characterize a particular pattern of scientific explanation, one which Father Georges Lemaitre, one of the originators of the Big Bang Theory, characterized as seeking out initial conditions which are ideally simple, from which the present world in all its complexity might have resulted through the natural interplay of known forces. Such theories can be found in fields ranging from cosmology to linguistics. They're structurally distinguishable from such theories as Newtonian mechanics, chemical atomism, or Mendelian genetics, but are equally legitimate products of scientific research. Although these evolutionary theories can be strung together to form a comprehensive history of the cosmos, the component theories themselves remain distinct and relate to one another only to the extent that they have to cohere at their interface. So, for example, we do not need an account of the origin of life in order to have a defensible account of the origin of species. In this talk, I'll focus on evolution as an account of the origin of species, first presenting a summary of the scientific idea, then discussing its consonance with Catholic theology, then its compatibility with Thomistic philosophy of nature and metaphysics, and ending with a very brief introduction to the history of the Catholic reception of the idea, that is, the history of the emergence of a Catholic evolutionism. The idea that the theory of evolution is fundamentally an attack on the Christian religion is a mistake. The theory is fundamentally an answer to questions like these. Why do we find in the upper, that is, more recent strata of the geological column, fossils of species that cannot be found in lower, that is, earlier strata? Or, why are there almost 500,000 different species of beetles? Or, why are living things so well adapted to their environment? An answer to these questions offered by the theory of evolution, which contains three central theses. First, transformism, that is, species originate by descent with modification from other species. Second, common ancestry. A single ancestral species might produce several different descendant species as a result of different transformations of different groups within the ancestral species. Third, natural selection. The transformations are largely, but not exclusively, the result of the fact that variants better adapted to, that is, more fit for, the ecological niche in which they live, are more likely to survive to reproductive maturity. With some caution, one might note that this theory has four features. The first is naturalism. This is not a challenge to the supernatural process of creation. It's just the idea that new species are the product of natural processes, not of separate acts of direct creation. Second feature is actualism. Species originate as a product of a natural process currently operative in nature. Third feature is gradualism. There is, at some level, a similarity between one generation and the next. Since small genetic changes can have significant effects on the organism they produce, gradualism at the genetic level, which is all that the theory requires, does not entail gradualism at the phenotypic level. Fourth, non-goal-directedness. The course of evolutionary change is not driven in some natural built-in direction. It's not like embryological development. This does not, however, mean that God did not so design the world as to yield what he wanted in creating it. In this article, I offer a very brief account of why scientists think that evolution is the best answer to a wide array of scientific questions. But in this presentation, I'm going to focus on other topics. The most interesting, and at the same time the most controversial aspect of the theory is its applicability to man. That is, whether man is a product of descent with modification from animals. Darwin and some modern biologists claim that he is. We can break the topic down into 4 sub-questions. Question 1. Whether evolution can explain the origin of the human body. Here, an alternative answer is particularly easy to defend, both on the basis of morphological, including biochemical and genetic similarities, and on the basis of the fossil record. Question 2. Whether evolution can explain the origin of any human mental powers. Darwin devoted an entire book to comparing human and animal emotions. Here also, he had at least some success. Animals do want and fear things and are, at least sometimes, reasonably successful at figuring out how to get or to avoid them. Question 3. Whether evolution can explain the origin of all human mental powers. Here's where the problems begin. Darwin did not fully appreciate the difference between conceptual and perceptual thought. Perceptual thought we share with animals. Conceptual thought is uniquely human. Conceptual thought is beyond the reach of a purely material being, and therefore producing such a being is beyond the reach of evolutionary processes. It required divine creation of a spiritual soul. Question 4. Whether evolution can explain the origin of the human soul. What I just said answers this question as well. One should add, however, that what I just said affects not just the origin of the first human being, but of every human being. The biological processes involved in human reproduction are no more capable of producing rational souls than are the evolutionary processes that produce the first human body. Despite the explanatory power and the broad scientific acceptance of the theory of evolution, the theory does face determined resistance in some Christian quarters. One form of Christian anti-evolutionism, calling itself creation science, rejects a wide array of well-established scientific theories in favor of a young earth, flood-based geology, and a direct divine role in the formation of various kinds of living things. Although many of its proponents claim that there is scientific evidence for this idea, it seems in fact to be based solely on an excessively literal interpretation of Scripture. A second form, calling itself intelligent design, focuses its attack on natural selection, which it claims is incapable of producing the complex biological structures and processes found in nature. It's important to note that rejection of this form of anti-evolutionism is entirely compatible with acceptance of the idea that the cosmos as a whole, the value of its constants, the details of its laws, was intelligently designed. Intelligent design of the cosmos does seem like a necessary consequence of a well-developed theory of creation. Direct intelligent design and manufacture of particular, even complex, biological structures and processes is not such a consequence. Is the theory of evolution consistent with Catholic theology? We can divide that question into 5 parts, one each centered on Scripture, creation, providence, moral theology, and the origin of the human race, anthropogenesis. First, with respect to Scripture, textual considerations alone suggest that God gave a role to secondary causes in the origin of living things. Let the earth bring them forth, it says. The idea that nature played a role in this bringing forth can also be found in the Fathers. Papal encyclicals, Leo XIII's Providentissimus Deus of 1893, Pius XII's Divino Afflante Spiritu of 1943, have emphasized the importance of recognizing figurative rather than scientific language when reading Scripture. Second, in articulating the connection between the theory of evolution and the doctrine of creation, it's important to distinguish the concept of absolute creation from that of derivative creation. Absolute creation is the bringing of something into being out of nothing. That applies to the material world as a whole, to angels, and to each individual human soul. But however much every individual material thing depends on God for its very existence, it's misleading to think of one's dog as created in the same sense that one's soul is created. Similarly, for biological species, they are created derivatively. Third, the idea that the mutations among which nature selects are random in a way that's inconsistent with divine providence is also mistaken. Random processes can be used as the best means to achieve an intended goal. Lotteries, for example, use random processes to achieve the goal of raising revenue for the sponsor. Fourth, some people think that the theory's use of the idea of survival of the fittest in a struggle for existence supports an ethics inconsistent with human love. This concern overlooks the idea that cooperative behavior often has survival value. More importantly, it overlooks the fact that the fundamentally descriptive theory of how nature works has no prescriptive implications about the choices that rational beings should make. Finally, there's the question of anthropogenesis. Here there are three subtopics. The first is ontological exceptionalism, the idea that human beings are a kind of being radically different from every other kind of being. Of course, dogs are different from butterflies and even more different from oak trees, but all of those are purely material beings. Human beings are not. That difference has two aspects, one behavioral, the other structural. The behavioral aspect centers on the powers of conceptual thought and free will. Some human actions are free from determination by antecedent states of our brain and our circumstances, free even from determination by our character. They can be the result of deliberate choice. Human thoughts include not just images, but abstract concepts. We can think of a triangle by forming an image, but we can also form the concept of a three-sided object. We can also think of a heliogon, a 1,000-sided object, but not by forming an image of one. The idea of heliogonality is accessible to us only as a concept. The structural aspect of exceptionalism is that man, unlike animals, has an immaterial and immortal soul. Thomistic philosophy and Catholic doctrine connects these two aspects by asserting that it is the immaterial human soul and not merely greater material, that is biological complexity, that makes both conceptual thought and free choice possible. Free choice and conceptual thought are not the kinds of powers that a purely material being can possess. So, Darwin's extension of his theory to the origin of human beings, not just of human bodies, fails. That failure does not put into question the theory's soundness as an explanation of the origin of plants and animals, or even of the human body. It does show that the theory cannot provide a full account of the origin of the human person, and a fortiori of the human race. The structural aspect leads to the second subtopic, phylogenetic exceptionalism, or a distinctive origin of the human species. At the heart of this kind of exceptionalism is the creation of the human soul. Since every human soul was created immediately by God, the idea of evolution by natural processes from animal ancestors cannot provide a complete account of the origin of the first human beings. That doctrine does leave open the question of the origin of the human body. Was it formed by direct divine action on non-living matter? Did God infuse the created human soul into an animal body fully formed by natural evolutionary processes? Or did God form the first human body not directly from the slime of the earth, but from an evolved animal body, which he had to, or at least did, modify further before infusing into it a human soul? In 1950, Pope Pius XII, in his encyclical Humani Generis, wrote that the teaching authority of the Church does not forbid that, in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology, research and discussions on the part of men experienced in both fields take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution, in as far as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent and living matter. St. John Paul II said in 1996, that today, more than half a century after the appearance of that encyclical, some new findings lead us toward the recognition of evolution as more than an hypothesis. The third anthropogenetic subtopic is monogenesis, a matter of greater theological concern than the possible evolutionary origin of the first human body. Here there are two questions. First, did the human population have its origin in many distinct first human groups or in a single first human group? Polyphyletism versus monophyletism. Second question, if there was a single first human group, did it consist only of a single first couple or of an entire initial population? Monogenism versus monophyletic polygenism. The presumptive Darwinian answer was monophyletic polygenism, origin in one tribe of many individuals. This view later received additional support from the details of genetic variation common to human beings and chimpanzees. Catholic theology, by partial contrast, includes a monogenetic account not only in order to emphasize the specific unity of the human race, but as an implication of the doctrine of original sin as defined by the Council of Trent. Trent said the sin of Adam is, in its origin, one, is transfused into all men by propagation, not by imitation, and is in each man as his own. That doctrine seems to imply that there was a single original sinner or couple from whom every other human being is descended. And so, in addressing the question in his encyclical Humani Generis, Pope Pius XII wrote, "The faithful cannot embrace the opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him, as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. It's no way apparent," he went on to say, "how such an opinion can be reconciled with that which the sources of revealed truth and the documents of the teaching authority of the Church propose with regard to original sin, which proceeds from a sin actually committed by an individual Adam, and which, through generation, is passed on to all and is in everyone as his own." Although some Catholic theologians have tried to show how some form of polygenism can in fact be reconciled with the doctrine of original sin, they have not, at least not in my judgment, succeeded in doing so. I've argued that science does not, in any case, require abandonment of the traditional theological view. Details of that argument are in the article. Some Catholics have objected that the theory of evolution is inconsistent with the Thomistic philosophy so important to the articulation of Catholic theology. Others have developed what they call not just a Catholic, but a Thomistic evolutionism. They emphasize against the objectors and defenders of the compatibility of Thomism and evolution do not have to stand by everything that St. Thomas ever said about species and their origin, not, for example, confining the origin of species to the beginning of the world, nor God's direct formation of individual species, nor the fixity of species. Sufficient to a Thomistic evolutionism would rather be an inclusion of three philosophical theses that are at the core of Thomism: hylomorphic essentialism, proportionate causality, and teleology. What are those? Hylomorphic essentialism. Let's begin with that. Essentialism is the idea that ordinary-sized objects are irreducible, that is, not fully explainable by reference to the interactions of their parts, are mutable, that is, capable of persisting through some changes, though not through others, and intelligible. Hylomorphism is the idea that those objects are composites of matter, which individuates them, and a substantial form, which gives them their essence, making them the kinds of things that they are. Although some evolutionists have argued that essentialism is incompatible with evolutionary biology, claiming, for example, that it implies the fixity of species or clear boundaries between species, Thomistic evolutionists deny both connections. A Thomist can reject fixism, because the idea that an individual of one species does not have the power to produce offspring of another species does not preclude its being a contributor to a confluence of causes that so form matter as to produce an individual of a different species. On the question of clear boundaries between species, Darwinism requires only gradualism with respect to the genotypes of succeeding generations. Evolutionary developmental biology has shown that slightly different genotypes can undergo or give rise to very different developmental programs, producing very different phenotypes. Even cases of phenotypic similarity that might leave us unable to assign individuals to their respective species would only yield epistemic uncertainty. It would not undermine the claim that each individual belongs to one species or another, whether we can recognize which or not. It does not, that is, lead to metaphysical nominalism. The theory of evolution is therefore consistent with Aristotelian essentialism. So, proportionate causality, that's the idea that an effect cannot be greater than its cause. Anti-evolutionists claim that if the evolution of one species from another does not itself violate this principle, at least the evolution of higher species from lower ones does. St. Thomas, however, thought that his philosophy of nature could accommodate a transition from a vegetative to an animal state in the course of embryological development in animals. One does not have to agree with St. Thomas' embryology to see in his acceptance of this idea evidence that he did not think that the emergence of a higher from a lower form of life was ruled out by any principle of his philosophy of nature. How could this happen? Well, Daniel DeHaan, among others, has pointed out that in the evolution of higher from lower species, it is not each individual hylomorphic substance taken on its own in isolation from all other hylomorphic substances that has the potentiality and actuality for reducing novel substantial forms. It's the cosmos system of hylomorphic substances that possesses both the potentiality and the actuality for the adduction of the substantial forms of all hylomorphic species. This, he added, includes the abiogenesis and evolution of all living organisms, including the emergence of sentient animals. The Thomistic Aristotelian philosophy of nature does, therefore, allow the transformist history of life that's a central feature of the theory of evolution. Teleology is the idea that structures and processes are fully understood only by reference to some good that they serve. Some people think that St. Thomas' fundamentally teleological philosophy of nature cannot accommodate a history of life in which a natural selection of chance variations plays such an important role. The problem disappears, however, when one comes to see that there are two kinds of teleology. The first is a kind of intrinsic teleology characteristic of living organisms, the idea that structures and processes are fully understood only by reference to the good of the organism. For example, perspiration by reference to the regulation of body temperature. This is a teleology that's a central feature of Thomistic philosophy of nature, but nothing in evolutionary origins undermines this teleological aspect of living things. The second is a kind of extrinsic teleology characteristic of artifacts. Their structure and processes do not serve anything that can really be called the good of the artifact, though they may be understood by reference to the good of the user. For example, the structure of keys by reference to locks and those who need them. The natural world being, at root, the product of creation, and thereby being at least analogous to an artifact, a theist might reasonably expect at least some of its features to have an extrinsic teleology, that is, to serve some purpose intended by the Creator. St. Thomas said that the distinction and multitude of things comes from God's intention that His goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them. So one gets the biological diversity produced by natural selection as comprehensible by reference to extrinsic teleology. The insight that the answer provides is both entirely consistent with and quite independent of the evolutionary biological answer that diversity is explained by differential pressures on an animal population in different corners of its environment. Nothing in the Thomistic philosophy of nature requires that everything that happens in nature exemplifies intrinsic teleology. Natural selection itself may in fact have a purpose relative to creation of keeping phylogenetic lineages going in the face of changes in their environment, but such a purpose is not required of natural selection any more than there has to be a purpose of the tides or of the phases of the moon. Some processes might be merely byproducts of features that do exist for a reason, as spandrels are a byproduct of arches. We might call all that we've just discussed Catholic evolutionism, namely a synthesis of three theses. First, Christian naturalism, or the emphasis on secondary causality, extended from the functional to the formational economy of the natural world, in particular to the origin of biological species. Second, an exceptionalist anthropology. And third, an exceptionalist anthropology, including both at least partial evolution of the body and a full creation of the soul. At the margin of Catholic evolutionism is also monogenesis. A Catholic evolutionist must provide at least some account of how evolutionary anthropogenesis is compatible with original sin, not just as universal sinfulness, but as an historical explanation of that sinfulness. More broadly, Catholic evolutionism is the project of disentangling evolutionary biology from three things: from materialism, from a simple rejection of biblical narrative, and from anti-exceptionalist or animalist anthropology. I discuss the most important part of the history of this idea in some detail in my book, The Origins of Catholic Evolutionism, 1831 to 1950. In the article, I presented just a few highlights. The history of Catholic evolutionism began in the early years of the 19th century, before Darwin's theory emerged, with Belgian geologist Jean-Baptiste Daulieu-Dauois, 1783 to 1875, he argued that transformism was theologically more plausible than its then popular rival, successive creation, as an explanation of the faunal succession evident in the fossil record. Another important figure was English biologist St. George Jackson Mivart, 1827 to 1900. His parents called him St. George, so he's not a saint by approval of the Congregation of Causes. But anyway, Mivart first articulated the now standard idea of anthropogenesis as the infusion of a created soul into an evolved body. The ideas that constitute this synthesis thus emerged early and were widely discussed in Catholic periodicals, encyclopedias, and textbooks, with an early general agreement that an evolutionary account of plant and animal origins, whether true or false, was not theologically problematic. Early official reservations about the acceptability of evolutionary anthropogenesis receded over the first half of the 20th century, as is evident from the text of Pope Pius XII's encyclical Humani Generis of 1950. Since then, the idea of a mixed anthropogenesis, evolution of the body and creation of the soul, seems to have become something of a consensus view among Catholic theologians and scientists, despite the continued objections of a few Catholic anti-evolutionists. The Catechism seems to see this idea, true or false, as not raising any theological problems. Thank you for your interest and for listening. If you'd like more detail on this, read the article on evolution in the Encyclopedia, or if you'd like a lot more detail, you can read the book that I mentioned, The Origins of Catholic Evolutionism.